Welcome, everyone, to the October 26th meeting of the SeaTac Stakeholder Advisory Roundtable. I'm Brian Scott with BDS Planning, the facilitator today. We have an action-packed agenda, welcome and introductions, an announcement related to the Part 150 noise study. And then we have several presentations about sustainable aviation fuels. Both Alaska Airlines and Delta Airlines will be sharing their efforts. We'll have updates on the Federal Policy Working Group and the Aviation Noise Working Group. And then we're going to hear about the Port of Seattle's SeaTac work on air emissions reductions. And then we're going to hear from the Federal Aviation Administration about sustainable aviation fuels. Those are spread out a little bit to accommodate various presenters' schedules. And then we'll have our regular update on the Sustainable Airport Master Plan, time for public comment, and next steps. This is a virtual meeting. I encourage all START members and presenters to keep your cameras on if you can, so we all can stay engaged and be fully part of the discussion. Please put away any distractions, close the door, put away your email, and stay engaged in this meeting. Make everybody's time as productive as possible. I'm Brian Scott with BDS Planning. I'm joined by my colleague, Dory Krapanics, who's taking notes and available to troubleshoot any logistics that you have. We've updated the Zoom facilitation platform. We're using a Zoom webinar style format, which allows the people that are active participants in the meeting to be visible and to speak. And members of the audience who are just watching are here, and they can hear us and see us, but we can't see or hear them except during public comment when folks are coming in to speak. START members and guest speakers can speak during the meeting. And can use the chat to communicate with facilitators, guest speakers, and the lead port staff. Recognize that if you send a chat, it's going to be visible to all those people, not to the observers. And when it's time for public comment, the facilitator will enable observers to do that participation. Chat isn't available for them. START members, you're all familiar with who those are. We have representatives from the 6 START member cities, Burien, Federal Way, Des Moines, Tukwila, Normandy Park, and SeaTac, as well as representatives of Delta Airlines, Alaska Airlines, and the Port of Seattle staff. These folks are the folks I mentioned that are available to participate in the conversation. With that, let me welcome Lance Little, the Airport Managing Director, for some welcoming remarks. Lance?
Thank you, Brian. I want to thank everyone for being with us tonight. This is our 5th meeting for the year. Though he cannot be with us tonight, I'd really like to start by thanking Chris Hall, one of Federal Way's 2 community representatives, for his years of service.
Chris is actually here, Lance.
He's here. Oh, yeah. I was told he was here, then I was told last minute he was not going to be here. Chris, glad you're here. So we can personally say thank you. Chris has been one of the Federal Way's 2 community representative, and I just really want to thank him for the years of service as part of START, but also as part of the working group. He has been an active member since the roundtable inception. And Chris, for those of you who have been in these meetings, he has a really deep understanding of our airspace and how aircraft operate within it, and always offer really, really valuable input. So Chris, I just want to say thank you for your service, and you will be missed. So thanks. Glad you're here today. So we have a very packed agenda tonight. So I'm going to be very quick with my comments. The theme of tonight's meeting is air quality and the efforts underway to lessen aviation impact on air quality. We have with us experts from the airport, from the airlines, from the FAA. They will cover the various research efforts and programs surrounding aircraft emission, with a special focus on SAF, or what we call sustainable aviation fuel. Stephanie Main, the airport's climate program manager, is with us again. She's being joined by Scott Coughlin, the Director of Sustainability at Alaska Airlines, and Stephanie Shu, the General Manager of Sustainability at Delta Airlines. And returning to StART for another appearance is Dr. Jim Haldeman, who is the Chief Scientific and Technical Advisor with the FAA's Office of Environment and Energy. So I want to say thank you to all for being at StART tonight. I look forward to the presentations and the discussion that I'm sure the presentation will generate. Now, before we launch the air quality presentation, I first want to give Stan Shepard, the airport's noise program senior manager, the opportunity to announce the beginning of the port's multi-year effort to launch and complete SCA's next Part 150 noise study. The study will look at SCA's current and future noise footprint to see what has changed since the previous study that was completed back in 2014. The Part 150 study also evaluates the port's current noise insulation program and recommends possible changes and enhancement. Other areas of focus for the study includes an evaluation of SCA's noise abatement efforts and an assessment of SCA's noise monitoring system. Staff were at the Port Commission meeting yesterday to begin the process of securing funding for a noise consultant to oversee SCA's next Part 150 noise study. Now, let me just remind everyone and stress that this is a multi-year effort, and yesterday's discussion at the commission meeting was just the first step. The port pledges to keep StART in the loop and engage with the study every step of the way. So with that said, I will now hand over to you. Stan, it's all yours.
Thanks, Lance. And I think you said most of it there. So I'll just do a recap of what we're at. So it is the time to start looking at our noise programs again. And through that, we call this study a Part 150. It's through the Federal Aviation Regulation. Part of that is the Part 150, so that's why it's named that way. And it is a multi-year effort to update our noise contours, our noise remedy boundary area, and take another look at all of our programs associated with noise. The goal of a Part 150 study is to reduce the noise impacts to the 65 DNL boundary area, and DNL is the noise metric that the FAA requires us to use in this evaluation. It's a yearly average of noise that's produced by all aircraft operating at the airport during a given year. The study will have ample opportunity for public input. That's a big part of it, and to weigh in on what issues the public believes are associated with noise and possible opportunities to mitigate it. We will look at not only possible additions to our noise insulation programs, but any improvements that we can make to how aircraft are operating within the vicinity of the airport that could actually provide a benefit to reducing that 65 DNL contour, no matter how small or large it could be. And this is also our opportunity to do a very strategic system-wide evaluation of our noise monitoring system to make sure that any changes to that program might be warranted. And projects identified in this study and approved by the FAA in what we call our final noise compatibility plan then become eligible. We can apply for grant funding at about 80% cost of those programs that we'll be implementing as a part of that. And as part of the study, we also want to be very cognizant about community equity in our outreach to ensure that everybody has an equal opportunity to voice their ideas at the table. And as Lance stated, we're only at the consultant procurement stage of this game right now. And once the consultant is hired, we can begin development of a full project scope and plan for implementation of the study. Most of next year, we'll be collecting and analyzing a large amount of data, which is mostly to do with flight tracks, operational data, fleet mix data, current and future on the fleet mix of what the airlines plan to do with their fleets, and also all land use associated with the airport vicinity and the impacts with it. And we're assuming that most of the public outreach will begin in around 2024. And as Lance stated, we are really expecting StART to be an integral part of the entire study. So that's the introduction. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Moira?
Hi, I'm wondering if when you do your data analysis, if there's any way to identify significant noise events, because we don't hear sound on an average. And so that's my question.
Okay, yeah. So we do plan on doing what we call supplemental noise metrics. They're not actually a part of the full analysis, but it is a good indication of what you're hearing out there. So that information will be presented during the study. And again, when we're working with StART and the public on really scoping of what they want to see in the process, we definitely want to have those kind of comments come forward so we can include them in the study.
Thank you.
Jeff?
Yeah, hi Stan. Hey, does the Part 150 study dovetail in any way with the evaluation of the appropriateness of the 65 decibel standard?
It does not, because the FAA's policy right now is the 65 DNL contour. So unless the FAA changes that policy at some point in the future, we have to use the standard that they set in their federal regulations.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Thank you.
Any other questions for Stan? Chris?
Thank you.
You're muted, Chris.
Sorry. I'm just curious, if should the FAA change it in the future after this Part 150 is completed, will the 60 DNL contours be drawn and be known, or would you be required to do another Part 150 to determine what those new contours are?
Yeah, we're proceeding with this study as with the policy that's in place right now with the 65. So if at some point in the future beyond this Part 150, they change the level of significance with that to a lower level, we could undertake a new Part 150 or a new noise exposure map update for that.
Anybody else? Okay, I skipped over a couple of the ground rules earlier, so let me just make sure that everybody gets the message. We want you to participate. Please focus on the subject at hand. Represent the constituency that you're here to represent. Respect diverse views. Communicate fairly. Everybody's doing a great job of all of these. Participate fully, honestly, and fairly. Speak respectfully. Keep an open mind. Acknowledge all participants and allow people to share without fear of criticism. Dory and I'll be committed to neutrality, transparency, clarity, make sure each voice is heard, begin and end on time, and clear follow-up. As I mentioned, only StART members participate until we get to the public comment. 10 people have signed up for public comment. Those 10 will be called on. Please limit your comments to 2 minutes. We will enable your audio and video for public comments when the time comes. StART meetings are not officially recorded, audio or video. We have been notified that somebody is planning to record this meeting. Any recordings by participants or member of the public are not considered official or necessarily accurate records of the meeting, but somebody is recording tonight. With that, we're going to move into the beginning of these presentations on sustainable aviation fuels. We've got really a great collection of experts with us tonight. First, starting off with the airlines, we have Scott Coughlin from Alaska Airlines and Stephanie Hsu from Delta Airlines. Welcome. Happy to have you here. I've got your slides. Scott is going first. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you everyone for being here this evening. Scott Coughlin, Director of Sustainability. Next slide, please, Brian. So really what I wanted to kind of give you all an overview of this evening is how we're setting out our path to net zero by 2040 at Alaska. We've set a 5-part pathway, of which SAF is one of them, but there are a number of different ways, and I just kind of wanted to run through them quickly. So what we're doing in terms of cutting our carbon emissions is to, first of all, look at operational efficiencies. So we're looking at how we reduce auxiliary power units usage at the gate, which burns jet fuel. We're looking at ways that we can bring in things like single engine taxi where it's available. So we're reducing the amount of aviation fuel used and then ultimately the amount of carbon that's used. As you may well have seen today from the announcement around the purchase of additional Boeing 737 MAX aircraft, we are renewing our fleet and replacing it with significantly more fuel-efficient aircraft. The aircraft that we're now retiring and replacing with the 737 MAX, the newer aircraft are about 25% more fuel efficient, which means less emissions and less fuel burned. The big one for us, though, is around sustainable aviation fuels. Like most of US airlines, we're aiming for around 10% of our fuels to be sustainable by 2030, which is in line with the federal government's SAF Grand Challenge of 10% of all fuels to be based sustainable fuels by 2030. Our fourth part is we're looking at novel propulsion. So through 2040, what opportunities are there for us to move away from traditional jet aircraft to look at electrification? In all honesty, by 2040, if we are to get there, it's probably going to be in the areas of regional jets. For those of you who've kind of been following the developments around these, this isn't going to be something that we're going to see in mainline aircraft by 2040, in our view. The next piece and the final piece, once we've gone through all these, is we are looking at carbon offsetting technologies. We have a venture arm called Alaska Star Ventures, which is now kind of looking into what technologies are there around carbon capture that we can make some investments into. And then also we're now starting to look at what does a carbon offsetting strategy look like for Alaska Airlines. We've committed through 2025 that we will not go above our 2019 CO2 emissions. So if we, as we grow our fleet, and as our schedule comes back online, what we will need to do is go out and look at high quality nature-based offsets. So that is one of those strategies that we're looking at now. And I appreciate this is kind of a 5-part path. It's not just SAF. So I haven't said too much on SAF, but we are making significant investments in sustainable aviation fuels. We're working with our fuel providers. We're working with the port. I was at a One World meeting. We're a member of the One World Alliance last week, and we're looking at ways in which we can make investments through One World to get access to more SAF. Around 1% of the fuel that we will use this year is sustainable aviation fuel. So as you can imagine, to get to 10% by 2030, we have some significant strides to make, and we're working with multiple partners to do that. The majority of the SAF that we get at the minute is through California, and we're working with the state to look at ways in which we can get this to Washington State, so we can do that here in our hometown. I just had a quick extra slide, and if I'm going over time, please let me know. But just to give you an idea, we have set a net zero carbon emission target through 2040. That doesn't mean that we haven't got interim targets in the meantime. So our current focus is on the carbon neutral growth, which I mentioned, through 2025. We've set a goal that we will be the most fuel efficient US airline. And to reinforce that, what we're doing is that all our employees, 10% of performance-based pay is actually based around our CO2 efficiency. So it now has a direct impact on our employees' bonuses. We've also committed to reduce emissions from our ground service equipment by 50% through 2025. And we're spending significant dollars now in terms of buying not just electrified, but also more fuel efficient vehicles for those that we can't step in and buy electrified ground equipment. We're making great strides in terms of our waste producing onboard products. Some of you may well have seen the boxed water rollout that we did by getting rid of plastic water bottles on board. By getting rid of those, we're estimating that the plastic waste that we're saving just from water bottles alone is around the equivalent of 18 737s if you take that weight. So significant plastic savings by moving to boxed water. We're looking to return to 2019 levels of onboard recycling. I'm heading down to San Francisco tomorrow to do a recycling audit. We hit 83% of all in-flight products were recycled in 2019. With COVID and with different hygiene regulations and different impetus, we kind of dropped behind, and we're now looking to get back to that. So we're making significant strides in terms of doing that. And then kind of the final piece for me around sustainability is we will balance 100% of operational water use through habitat restoration. And we're doing that with the Bonneville Foundation, primarily in Alaska.
Thank you, Scott. If that's your last slide, are there questions of Scott? Jeff.
Yeah, Scott, is sustainable aviation fuel cost competitive with standard fuel yet?
Not at this moment in time. It's significantly more expensive than jet fuel. So the Inflation Reduction Act that brought in some tax credits, and we're seeing discussions here in Washington state around it as well, is helping to narrow that cost differential, but it is still significantly more expensive. And the only way that we're going to see it come down to the same kind of price as regular jet fuel is through significant growth in the market. We need it to get to scale, and we're not there yet. So all the airlines and all our state and federal governments are working hard, but we need to get to scale before we can get cost competitive for sustainable aviation fuels. Great question. Thank you.
Can I ask another one?
Absolutely. I'm at your disposal.
Okay. I understand that you guys are ready to use as much of it as you can get, especially if the cost comes down. What exactly is your involvement, if any, in getting it more produced and getting it transported? I don't really see that as your bailiwick, but I'm obviously the success of the program depends on that. And I wondered how you might be helping to motivate that.
No, absolutely. Another great question. It's a huge sort of cross-company effort. I work with our government affairs, both at a federal and a state level, who are talking to our elected officials. And we're also working with our fuel purchasers. So we're talking to the SAF producers. How can we help them in terms of getting facilities? How can we help them in terms of permitting in the various states that we work in? And are there deals that we can make with them potentially up front to look at purchasing the aviation fuel to get that investment? So there are multiple initiatives, and the sustainability team are part of it. But as I'm sure you can appreciate, it's more than just the sustainability team. It covers, a wide range of actors across the company.
Thank you.
Any other questions of Scott? I'm sure he'll stay around if more come up. Why don't we go ahead with Stephanie? The floor is yours.
Thanks, Brian. And I will echo and agree with everything that Scott said. So it's great to hear about what other airlines are doing in this space. So I want to kind of start by talking about our overview of sustainability goals. We can go to the next slide. So we really kind of think about everything that we want to achieve in the short, medium, and long term. And so our long-term overarching goal is that we want to get to net zero by 2050, and that is through our entire value chain. So all our scope 3 emissions, working with our suppliers, a very big goal. But we kind of move it back a little bit to, we just recently got our science-based targets validated, and that's what we considered our medium-term goal. So that is improving on emissions intensity by 45% by 2035 compared to a 2019 level. So that's more of an intensity level versus an absolute emissions reduction. And our short-term goal is to use 10% SAF by 2030. So as you can kind of see in this graph, there are 3 buckets, and Scott kind of alluded to this also. You can see on the purple line, if Delta did nothing to address our emissions and we continue to grow, the purple line kind of shows our trajectory on an absolute emissions basis. Fleet right now, that purple graph, is the largest thing that is improving our fuel efficiency and reducing our emissions right now. The operational improvements, which we'll talk about a little bit, is everything that we can do to our fleet currently to continue to save fuel. And you can see that SAF until 2035 is the other largest bucket on how we're going to meet our medium-term goal of science-based targets. We are planning to kind of bring this out to the 2050 level, but SAF will become an even bigger part of this bucket as you see the graph go down to get to net zero by 2050. Next slide. So like I mentioned, the fleet is the biggest part of our strategy right now to reduce emissions. So every aircraft that we are replacing at the moment can be up to 20 to 25% more efficient on a per seat mile basis than the aircraft it is replacing. Next slide. And then on operational improvements. So we just recently revived our Carbon Council, which is a group of working level and then senior level people within our organization that are really focused on saving every gallon of fuel that's possible and working across the divisions to really target that. So for example, one of the things that we've been focused on for a very long time is reducing the amount of APU use. So I think when we go into warm weather stations and the flight attendants typically ask to open the vents and then close the shades, that can help keep the aircraft up to 10 degrees cooler, which means less auxiliary power unit use, which means fuel savings. But in order to do that, there's a lot of cross-divisional education, tracking, and just having all the different groups understand what to do. So there is a hyper focus around the organization to figure out how to save fuel in any way possible. And then the last one, sustainable aviation fuel, as Scott talked about, this is going to be a large part of all airlines' plans to achieve any of our climate goals. Sorry, next slide. And so we have a goal at Delta, which aligns with the SAF Grand Challenge, that 10% of our jet fuel by 2030 will be sustainable aviation fuel. So right now, Delta has offtake agreements. That's about 400 million gallons for us by 2030. So right now we have about...
What's an offtake agreement?
Great question. So that is an agreement to use the SAF and purchase the SAF when the facilities come up and running. So a lot of these facilities, to Scott's point, they're not available and they're not up and running at the moment. So it's a forward contract that when the facility comes up and running, we will take the fuel, and our agreements go up to 200 million gallons for the 2030 timeframe. Jeff?
At what price will you take that fuel? Does it have to be competitive with regular jet fuel at that point?
We do look for fuel that is competitive, but everything that we're looking at still has a premium. And currently, the fuel that we are taking right now, in this year, we're working with a lot of our corporate customers because we're looking at ways to reduce our Scope 1 emissions and address the emissions from burning the jet fuel. A lot of our corporate customers, as they're also setting science-based targets, are looking for ways to reduce the emissions from their business travel. And we've been partnering together to address the premium that is associated with the extreme, premium that is associated with jet fuel at the moment to make that a little bit less. And we hope that as more of these facilities come on in the future, as things like blender's tax credit, low carbon fuel standards, and different state and local initiatives come online, that the price parity does become much closer to jet fuel over time.
Well, there's a lot of facilities that have to be built, I think, and a lot of distribution network that has to be set up for this to become price competitive, much like with standard jet fuel.
Yeah. So the one other area that we are heavily focused on, so one is getting the offtake agreements in place to get to the amount of fuel that we need by 2030. And we also joined another coalition called the First Movers Coalition from the White House that's focused on the sectors that are difficult to decarbonize, and aviation is one of those sectors. The intent is really to mobilize and spur investment into technologies that will help decarbonize those very difficult to decarbonize sectors. And as part of that, our goal is that 5% of the fuel that we're using in 2030, which is going to be half of this 10% goal, will have a whole life cycle emissions reductions of 85% or more. So one of the things that we're doing is, as Scott mentioned, just looking at different ways to help facilities get up and running, doing offtake agreements, getting as much supply as possible. But one of the other things that we're also looking at is based on the different technology types, that technology pathways for SAF and the different feedstocks for SAF. How are we going to continue to improve on the carbon intensity and reduce emissions to get closer and closer to the 85% and then potentially even 100% as we go towards 2030 and then 2035 and then our ultimate goal of net zero by 2050. I think one other thing that I just want to mention here is in the SAF space, but I think in all of these different areas, whether it's operations or fleet, but SAF also, this is not something, that Delta, we can do on our own or want to do on our own. So it's a huge effort, both within the company, working with cross-divisional efforts, but also with a lot of different stakeholders, whether that's governments, whether that's our corporate customers, standard setters, everybody kind of has to be engaged on this to make sure we're pushing together as an industry to get the SAF that we need to meet our 2035, 2050, 2040 goals.
Are you working with any of the existing fossil fuel companies on this?
Yes. So we have many discussions with a lot of these because we realize they are making most of the fuel right now. And so last year we did a test co-processing with Chevron, and we continue to have discussion with a lot of the big oil and gas majors to figure out what we can kind of do to scale up SAF.
Because they have the infrastructure in place to move it already.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anybody else have questions for Stephanie? Okay. Scott, Stephanie, thank you both very much for joining us and sharing this interesting information. I know everybody involved here encourages you to meet all those goals and as soon as possible. So thank you for your efforts.
Sorry about that, Brian. I was trying to push the wrong button now. I've got a couple questions.
Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Stephanie. She mentioned something about the onboard weight reduction. Does it mean that the passengers will be allowed to carry less weight? And will this efficient move come at the expense of the passengers?
That is not what I was referring to in that slide. So that is optimizing catering that we're putting on board, or any way there's possible that we can reduce weight, whether that's from seats, lighter versions of anything. That's what we mean by reducing weight as much as possible. So optimizing the amount of food we put on board, things like that. But we're not addressing the amount passengers can bring on board right now.
Did you have another question, Robert?
Well, since it said that, right, you will be retiring about 25% of the aircrafts, right, that are, and probably replacing them with smart ones. What would you do with those aircrafts? Are you send them to scrap metal, or are you just going to ship them out to some third world countries?
That's a great question. I think some of them are sold, and then some of them we take the parts that are still usable and upcycle certain parts of them. But that is an area of focus for end of life of aircraft that we no longer use.
Upcycle means use those parts in some other airplane?
Yes, but I think mostly that's seats and that kind of thing that we part and use in other parts of the operation where possible.
Okay. Other questions? Peter.
So we've talked about the price of these alternative fuels. How efficient are they? And do they have any particulates or other emissions that might be different but equally noxious?
So we take that one, Seth? I can kind of start on that one.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I was talking to myself. Yeah, but I can join in after you, Stephanie, if you want to.
Okay, great. So we, when we're taking a look at sustainable aviation fuel as an alternative, sort of the number one thing we are looking at is greenhouse gas emissions on the full life cycle basis. So everything from the feedstock, whatever that feedstock might be, to the production, to transport, and comparing that to what the life cycle emissions of conventional jet fuel is. So for example, the fuel that we have taken, the sustainable aviation fuel that we have taken this year on a full life cycle basis is 75% less than conventional jet fuel.
%75 less what?
In greenhouse gas emissions.
But how about in the burn efficiency in the engines? I know in the maritime industry is having a heck of a time because the alternative fuels that are proposed to the maritime industry are gum up the works of the engines. They don't burn as efficiently. They're just not as good. And the maritime industry has pretty basic, heavy bunker fuel. It's not nearly as refined as jet fuel is.
I can maybe help there, Stephanie. I came across from maritime, Peter. So I was working on this at the maritime before I moved across to aviation. Very, very different fuels. The drop-in fuels that we're seeing for SAF are very different to the drop-in fuels we're seeing with maritime. Maritime's also looking at a lot of things like, not even using regular diesel fuel. They're looking at ammonia as well as a potential solution. So very different to the drop-in fuels that we're looking at here. It's a drop-in fuel. It's a synthetic jet fuel. You aren't going to see the same issues.
Do you mind if I just pop in here with a quick response?
By all means.
Jim Heilman.
Why don't you introduce yourself to the group?
Yeah, Stephanie Mine, Climate Program Manager at the airport. I know Jim Heilman, when he joins us a little bit later, he could talk your ear off about all of the emission reduction testing that has been done federally and internationally. But what they've seen so far in tests, when they've actually looked at the criteria air pollutant emissions and the fine particle reductions, is that on a 100% basis, so say you used 100% fuel, sustainable aviation fuel, you get about an 80% reduction in fine particle pollution and about a 90% reduction in sulfur. So that's what you're seeing at 100%. It's relatively linear. So if you blend it 50-50 or 30-70, you're seeing about the same percentage as it goes down. Again, maybe when Jim's on the line a little bit later, he might be able to answer with more specificity, but it is showing that because the feedstocks that are being used to make this don't have those same contaminants like the fossil fuel crude, that you are seeing that huge reduction in fine particle pollution coming out of the engines.
So what about the volume efficiency? Will an airplane be required to change fuel tanks, add fuel tanks? No.
No, these are drop-in fuels, and the energy density is pretty comparable to the fossil equivalent. We've actually seen some where it's a few percent actually more efficient. The energy density is a little bit higher in this fuel, but it's pretty darn comparable.
What is drop-in? I don't understand that term.
Oh, just meaning that you were referring to the maritime fuels, or even if some people have a history with biodiesel, and you were talking about sort of gumming up the works. Sustainable aviation fuel is drop-in, meaning no changes are required to the engine, no changes are required, and that's by design. Sustainable aviation fuel is certified and standardized in a way that it is meant to be dropped in, so you don't need to alter anything.
Anybody else have a question for Stephanie or Scott? Okay, thanks again to you both. We're going to move on. We'll hear again about the port and the FAA on this same topic in a few minutes. Before we go there, we're going to have an update on the Federal Policy Working Group and the Aviation Noise Working Group. First off, Eric Schinfeld is going to give us an update, and we're looking also for an okay on going forward with a letter that Eric's about to fill us in on. Eric, take it away.
Fantastic. Well, good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Eric Schinfeld, Senior Manager of Federal and International Government Relations here at the Port of Seattle. I'll talk, like Brian said, first about what we actually did in our last Federal Policy Working Group meeting, and then present to you the letter that we're hoping to get everyone's head nod on as we move forward here. So a couple of things that we did at the last Federal Policy Working Group meeting, which took place last month in September. First of all, we did hear a really fantastic presentation on the 65 DNL noise contour. And of course, most of you who are in this group know that that is the official FAA policy as it relates to noise annoyance, and where the area around the airport that we are allowed to use federal funding for noise insulation. So that's 65 DNL noise contour, the area around the airport where there's a day-night level average of 65 decibels around certain homes and buildings. Really fantastic presentation, and really informed our thinking on next steps related to the policy side of considering the 65 DNL, which I'll talk about in a second. We also discussed the letter that I'm about to present to you tonight, And then finally, we discussed the idea of a fly-in to Washington, D.C. next year. This is something that StART and the Federal Policy Working Group had scheduled actually for the first week of March 2020. We canceled that at the last minute as the COVID pandemic really hit full steam. But we do believe that, particularly after we send this letter, hopefully with your approval after tonight, that there's a real opportunity to bring some of our key stakeholders from the port and the surrounding cities to Washington, D.C. to meet directly with not only our members of Congress, but the Biden administration, the FAA, et cetera, and talk about some of our priorities related to aviation noise and emissions. So those are the three things we talked about: the 65 DNL presentation, the letter, and the DC fly-in. And then let me move to the letter, and then I'll stop and happy to answer any questions about either the meeting or the letter. So next year, 2023, is when Congress is scheduled to review and hopefully pass the next round of the FAA's reauthorization bill. Every 5 years or so, give or take, Congress reauthorizes the FAA. That's something they have to do by statute. But it's really an incredible opportunity each time to adjust and add to FAA policy programs and funding. We spent a lot of time in 2018 tracking the last FAA bill, the 2018 FAA reauthorization bill. And that bill has actually informed a lot of the work of the Federal Policy Working Group, because there was a more robust section on aviation noise and emissions than in any past FAA reauthorization bill. So as we look to 2023, to the next reauthorization bill, we've spent a lot of time over the past 6 months in the Federal Policy Working Group identifying which of our shared federal priorities, the ones that we work together as the port in the 6 cities to develop, which of those should we really push for and prioritize to include in the 2023 FAA reauthorization bill. In the materials that were sent to you as part of this meeting, you see a draft of that letter. And we really tried to be thoughtful about this letter. We could have listed all 20 or so of our priorities. We knew that when you send somebody a list of 20 priorities, it's really sending them a list of no priorities because there's just too many for them to deal with. And so we identified 7, and I will talk through those very, very briefly here. They fall into a couple of buckets. The first bucket, which is, if you're tracking the letter, is on page 2 of the letter, is around addressing the impact of overflight noise on near airport communities. One policy priority around FAA funding for secondary insulation for quote unquote failed packages, which is a policy that we've long supported, working closely with US Representative Adam Smith on legislation that he's introduced. Because if there are packages that were installed with federal funding and port funding that no longer are providing that noise benefit, we do believe that there should be opportunities to go back and fix those packages. Second is another piece of legislation that U.S. Representative Adam Smith has sponsored, the Aviation Noise and Emissions Mitigation Act, which would bring the EPA back into the business of addressing aircraft noise and emissions, which we think makes all the sense in the world given the U.S. EPA's focus on environmental protection. It is the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Their expertise in the impact on human health and the environment would make them a natural partner. So that piece of legislation. Then finally, in this section, we've talked about the 65 DNL. There was a question earlier during Stan's presentation about changes to the 65 DNL. And we've been really focused on this idea that the FAA did release in April 2020 their environmental survey, which did find significant noise, in March 2021, significant noise annoyance well beyond the current 65 DNL, but there's no clear path for follow-up, no clear path for next steps. And we really believe strongly that there should be. You can't just release a noise annoyance study and then not figure out where to go from there and what that means for the 65 DNL. And we've actually proposed 2 steps within there, the creation of an aircraft noise advisory committee that would include a number of stakeholders, federal stakeholders, airports, airlines, community groups, to advise the FAA on next steps related to that noise annoyance study, and then put in place a specific deadline for action based on the results of that committee. So we're really excited about those potential steps that could be included in the FAA reauthorization bill related to overflight noise. The second section is related to aircraft emissions, obviously very germane to our topic tonight on sustainable aviation fuels. Huge progress by Congress in August in the passage of a sustainable aviation fuels blenders tax credit, as well as infrastructure funding to fund additional infrastructure necessary for sustainable aviation fuels. But there are additional things that need to be done, and really want to make sure that we're continuing to move forward on implementing them as part of the FAA reauthorization bill. Next is the Environmental Mitigation Pilot Program. That was a one-time grant program created in the 2018 FAA reauthorization bill. So we believe that program should be continued. It's a great program, specifically focusing on new technologies that can address both aircraft noise and emissions issues. And then finally in this section, U.S. Representative Adam Smith's legislation for protecting airport communities from Particle Emissions Act, which would deal with these ultrafine particulates. And U.S. Representative Adam Smith's bill is a really important next step to bring federal attention to this issue of ultrafine particulates and potential health impacts. And then the final section is regional airport capacity. So I think many of you in this forum have talked about how, all the work that we can do on aircraft noise and emissions around SeaTac, that's all well and good. But ultimately, if more and more aircraft are coming here, it won't truly address the root of the problem. And so obviously the state process, the State Aviation Coordinating Commission has its process to identify where future airport capacity will be somewhere in the region or somewhere else in the state. And we believe that the FAA and the federal government can play a really key role in that in terms of policy and regulatory and also funding. Once the state process concludes and we identify where that future airport capacity could be, we'll need that federal partnership to actually build out that capacity. So those are the 7 items that are in this letter. We have consensus among the members of the Federal Policy Working Group. We're really excited about this letter. We think this really has a chance to, number one, be included in the FAA reauthorization bill, and then obviously become law and really make a difference on the issues that we care about. So I will stop talking there. Happy to have any additional feedback on this letter, either from members of the Federal Policy Working Group or others here in the meeting tonight. And again, our goal is to ultimately get your approval. We'll get signatures from the Port and the 6 cities, and then we'll share this, send this letter to our members of Congress, and then follow up with that potential 2023 DC fly-in. So I will stop there. Sorry to talk so much, but hopefully that's gives you all the information you need.
So questions or comments for Eric? As he mentioned, the Federal Policy Working Group gave a thumbs up to proceeding with this letter, and we will be asking you the same question here in a moment. But before we do that, any questions or comments for Eric? Denise. No?
I think Denise might be in the audience, but she should be. She is a Des Moines representative and should be as a panelist.
Okay, can we correct that? Moira, go ahead with your question in the meantime.
I'm wondering what, just a simplified summary of the reauthorization process. What's the timeline for that typically, and the steps involved?
So this is a bill in Congress. And so, in 2018, the last bill was passed, and it's quite an extensive piece of legislation. It deals with all of the regulatory authorities and programs and policies that the FAA deals with. So it was passed in 2018. It's a 5-year reauthorization, so it runs out. And so Congress needs to pass a new one to continue the FAA doing its regular programs and policies and funding. In the past, Congress has not always kept to that 5-year timeline. And so what they'll do instead sometimes is pass an extension, extend the 2018 bill for 6 months or a year or whatever that is. But ultimately their goal is to pass the bill, like any piece of legislation has to pass the House, has to pass the Senate. If there are differences between the two, they have to be reconciled, and then a final version has to be passed. So we have heard a lot from our members of Congress and others in DC that they are very focused on getting this done. In fact, on the Senate side, they've already started to draft their version of the bill. Obviously, the November elections will determine who's in charge of various houses of Congress and what their priorities will be. But we really believe that these priorities are really nonpartisan and bipartisan. So we're hopeful that whoever is in charge will be open to the conversation about including these in the FAA bill.
So you think passage sometime in 2023 is likely?
The deadline would be October of 2023 unless there's an extension.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I think it's a great letter. I appreciate all the things that you put in there for us to help the local communities. I just want to come back to that same point and urge the port and Stan, when they're looking at this Part 150 and they're doing all the modeling and they're getting all that data and they're running through it, to go ahead and get lower contours than the 65 DNL. Should this letter be successful, should the FAA change it in the future to 60, we're ready to go, and we can take advantage of that and go, yeah, we know where the 60 contour is, we know where the 55 contour is. I mean, we know Minneapolis is paying out to 60, through a settlement. I think it just makes sense to be prepared to mitigate some of those damage that we may be doing in the future, and that's already happening. So.
Denise, your hand was up briefly earlier. Did you have a question or a comment?
I had a question, just given that I'm an alternate for this group. I did not see a copy of the letter, and I may have missed it. There were several emails on this, but is it something that you have to have that confirmation tonight, or if I got back with somebody tomorrow?
Yeah, absolutely. We're certainly not going to send before the November election on November 8th because folks are otherwise occupied. So if you have additional feedback, we'd be happy to take it.
Great. Well, I will check with Michael to see if he has a copy of that letter so we can review it. Thank you.
Great.
Anybody else? So for the START members that are present, are folks comfortable with this letter?
I haven't seen the letter. I don't know when it was sent, or I've seen the 3 PowerPoint presentations part of this meeting, but that's it.
Okay.
It was attached to the same email with the agenda, and I'm just looking here. It was sent on the 19th of October.
Thank you. I'll look for that. Thanks.
Yep. But happy to obviously have folks have it sent out again after this meeting, and it's like I said earlier, still welcome any additional feedback or questions.
So I see general agreement from the folks who are weighing in here, and a couple folks who haven't had a chance to look at it are going to look at it, and they know if they have questions or comments, they'll get them to Eric. And my sense is, unless somebody raises a serious objection to Eric, he can proceed in sending the letter out to the cities for signature. I see Robert's hand up. Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, Eric, actually, that's a brilliant letter. I know, I was fascinated. I would like to draw attention on the congressional trip that you are trying to organize. In fact, you were trying to organize a couple of years back. What would be the benefit of flying all the way from here to Washington, D.C., just to meet our local representatives when we can actually meet them when they are here in their offices with the whole group rather than just a selected few?
Yeah, well, I think, Robert, we can do both. Absolutely. Part of the visit to DC would include members of the Biden administration, federal officials, the FAA. So I do think there are folks that we can't meet with. And I do also find that traveling to our members of Congress offices in DC has a lot of value, that showing the effort, showing the commitment to those issues is impactful. Absolutely. But thanks to technology like we're on tonight, we can absolutely have some of those same meetings virtually, some of those same meetings when they're here in district. So I don't think it's an either or, but I do, in my experience as somebody who goes to DC on a regular basis, even though, I could just do a Teams meeting, I do think that there is value there, particularly for folks that are not our members of Congress, other members of Congress from other states, the Biden administration, et cetera. So. And we are, I'll just say as a final point to that, still in our next federal policy working group, we'll be talking exactly about the structure, because I think we want to your point, Robert, make it as valuable as possible. Who should go? How many people should go? Who should we meet with? How do we pay for all that? So we're still working on exactly what that looks like, and that'll be the topic of our next agenda for the Federal Policy Working Group meeting.
Thank you.
All right, I want to move us forward so we have time for, make sure we have ample time for the port on aviation fuels and for the FAA. So move us forward into the aviation noise working group update. Marco, take it away.
Thanks, Brian. Marco Milanese, the Community Engagement Manager out at the airport. And so the StART Aviation Noise Working Group last met not too long ago on October 10th, and it's been about 4 months since the group last met. So there was quite a bit to discuss and decide at that meeting. And like we always do, we start with a run through that Tom Fagerstrom provides of some of the StART Aviation Noise Working Group initiatives. And we started with the late night third runway agreement and how it's being used. And Tom reported that we had some heavier use this past summer of the third runway during the nighttime hours, and that was because of construction on the other runways. That work was completed earlier this fall, so now we're seeing a lot less operations on the third runway, where as of early October, we're averaging about, Tom reported about 2.8 late night landings each night on the third runway, which was a great improvement over the past summer. He also reported out on the late night noise limitation program, the third quarter numbers for that. And similar to previous quarters, we had exactly 3,133 total operations in those late night hours, and 197 or 6% of them exceeded noise thresholds. Same carriers had the top three exceedances. That's FedEx, China Airlines Cargo, and ATI Amazon Prime. Good news, though, is just prior to the meeting on the 10th, we had a very productive meeting between staff and representatives at Korean Air Cargo. They fly often during the late night hours. They're a cargo operator, and they frequently have noise exceedances during those late night hours. And so this is the first time we've been able to really sit down with them and talk about the program. Staff reiterated that they hope they could find ways to lessen their noise, and we provided them with ideas and steps they could take to be a better neighbor. Korean Air Cargo didn't make really any concrete commitments at that meeting, but they were engaged, they listened, and they did say they plan to incorporate quieter aircraft into their fleet. Servicing SEA will make every effort to do so in the coming years. So we then went and got an update on rolling takeoffs and the analysis done to date on rolling takeoffs. And Vince Mestry, our noise consultant on the Aviation Noise Working Group, provided that update. And based on his experience, when he compares rolling takeoffs to more traditional stop and go takeoffs, he believes it offers a real noise benefit to the surrounding community, and he used some visuals to demonstrate that to the working group. And he talked about the Oakland Airport experience, where they have language on the books that encourages the use of rolling takeoffs, and they have some numbers to back up that it has made a difference. We did some noise monitoring this past summer in an effort to kind of quantify the benefit of rolling takeoffs, and we haven't been able yet to capture any usable data to date that we could then share with the working group. So Tom talked about that, and then Vince provided some information and some guidance on how he thought we might be able to better accomplish that should we try to do some noise monitoring results in the future. But regardless, Vince, again, the noise consultant, believes there are really no downsides to encouraging the voluntary use of rolling takeoffs at SEA when they're possible. So we are, as a next step, as a working group, going to plan to develop some draft language that we can implement at SEA that encourages the voluntary use when possible of rolling takeoffs. The big topic at the meeting was reverse thrust, and a big thanks to Steve Osterdahl from Alaska Airlines for the 101 he provided on reverse thrust. He talked about what it is, why it works the way it does, how it's applied, and when it's used. And reminder just to everyone who's a part of tonight's call that reverse thrust was something that the Aviation Noise Working Group's ground noise study identified this past spring as a generator of noise on the airfield. So knowing that, the working group really made it a priority to find a way to lessen its impact on the surrounding community. And so in partnership with Alaska Airlines, Delta Airlines, and the FAA, and I just want to give each a really big thanks for their involvement with this language. It really made this process easy. We've developed updated draft language for the airport charge at SCA, and this is still draft language. But in a nutshell, this language change involves changing what was a voluntary request for carriers to minimize its use during the nighttime hours to a voluntary request to minimize its use 24 hours a day. Again, this is a voluntary language. I want to be clear about that. The airports do not have the authority or really want the authority to direct a pilot on how to slow down their aircraft. We're just voluntarily asking them to use it when possible and when it is practical. After a discussion about that language with the working group, they gave it a virtual thumbs up. And so that's where my update ends tonight. And then I'll hand things back to Brian so he can get the temperature check here with the full START on the reverse thrust language.
Questions for Marco or comments on the reverse thrust suggestion? Jeff.
One thing that came up in the working group that I thought was interesting was that 80% of the noise exceedances are caused by two aircraft type, operated mostly by not many airlines. And that was interesting because it gives a focus to which airlines we should mostly be engaging with. The other thing that came up in the discussion of the rolling takeoffs and the reverse thrust, and this is my term, not the term that was used in the discussion, is that getting pilots to kind of change their behaviors, and of course we want them to have absolute discretion. It sounded like it was a little bit like herding cats. So there are some long-term changes we might make, but it sounds like a slow process. Thank you.
If I could just jump in, but thank you, Jeff. Really two great points. You can change the language, you're right, and it's not going to change behavior. And so the second part of this effort when it comes to reverse threat is really an education campaign. And so with the help of the noise staff and others, we really want to go to the venues where the airlines meet at the airport or where operators meet so we can talk about the change of the language itself once it's final, should it be final, and why we think it's in everyone's best interest. So you can change the language, but I think even the bigger part of that is the communications campaign tied to that language.
Moira.
Let's see. I was intrigued by Scott's slide that talked about financial incentives to sustainability, and I assume that's throughout their organization. And I was curious about how efficient it is to do this reverse thrust. I sort of see it as a way to slow down the flight, get off the runway, and get to your gate as quickly as possible. And so I don't know much about how the mechanics of reverse thrusting, what they're doing. If it's just with their flaps or if there's some sort of energy involved in doing that. So, and I guess that's just sort of a comment. And then the other thing, I forget, a long time ago, I was flying planes and there's NOTAMs or something like that that are issued for airports, right? And do these recommendations, are those part of those NOTAMs that are issued for SeaTac?
Hoping someone from the noise team could jump in on the NOTAMs thing. I
can say something if it helps.
Okay. Right. We have a pilot with this as well.
Go ahead, Brian.
So one of the things that we do is we have various documents we reference before we land. One of them is called our...
Brian, could you introduce yourself? I don't know that.
Yeah, I'm a captain at Alaska Airlines. I'm a resident of Normandy Park. So we reference a lot of manuals and so forth before we land. And one of them is what we call our 10-9 document, which discusses all of the various special notes for that airport. And in those notes would be things like, for us at Seattle and for Alaska Airlines, in our other section, it talks about limiting reverse thrust to idle from 10 o'clock until 5 a.m. as a for instance. So that's where we would find that it wouldn't be in the NOTAMs necessarily. The NOTAMs are more operationally, these lights are out, that sign is busted, this procedure is not authorized, those sort of things. More operational of the airport itself. Individual operators may have their own special notes on top of that. So that may help.
So as a Alaska Airlines pilot, do you see, has there been any discussion about that financial incentive to be more sustainable and efficient?
Well, I think, for us, we just operate the airplane and we don't necessarily, we aren't trying to be extra efficient necessarily, but the airplanes are so efficient as they are. But this topic is enormous. There's all sorts of arrivals that we have on our arrivals into Seattle where we level off. When you level off, you advance the throttle, you burn more fuel as opposed to being at 36,000 feet and be idle, descend all the way down till near touchdown. So there's a lot of inefficiencies on the arrivals. I just flew today and we had a 100-knot tailwind on our way down to, to Burbank. And as a result, we flew extra slow. So we flew longer, lower power with more tailwind. So we burned less fuel on the way down to Burbank. So we're always doing that. We always have a cost index on our flight plan that tells us how fast to fly based on the wind and altitude and temperatures and so forth. So we're always doing it naturally. But we can't do much more than what we have to do to fly the airplane.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Brian. That was definitely illustrative. Again, I want to keep us going. Is everybody comfortable with the language that Marco reviewed? Again, the work group gave it a thumbs up. Is everybody okay with it, that language? The language I see is positive. Marco, I think you can assume that you, without objection, folks are okay there. Let's move forward into SeaTac's efforts at air emission reduction program. For that, we have Stephanie Main, who you've already met through the earlier conversation. Stephanie, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Brian. And thanks, everyone, for having me back. Today, I'm going to tackle the topic that I wasn't able to get to at the last START meeting, which was really kind of focusing on the programs other than sustainable aviation fuel that we're looking at that help reduce air emissions. And for this presentation, I'm focusing on what we call criteria air pollutants. And so that is the stuff you're breathing rather than the global climate pollutants and greenhouse gases that we talk about a little bit more often in this forum. So next slide. So I do want to highlight that the emission reduction programs where we are looking at those traditional air pollutants, where we're basically focusing when we're trying to reduce those emissions is anywhere that we have combustion of fossil fuels. So it's really not that different from the types of programs we have for reducing greenhouse gases because they both are connected to combustion of fossil fuels. But when it comes to the sort of local air pollutants, we do have some things that are more effective than others. And I'll give some illustrative examples, but basically the areas that we focus on more than other areas is really on where we have diesel emissions, and that's from diesel vehicles and generators. And that's because diesel tends to have more of the sort of carcinogenic and ultrafine particles coming from it. As you're probably aware, if you've driven behind a diesel truck that's older versus one that's newer, they're using the exact same ultra low sulfur diesel from the same pump even, but you see very different emissions coming out of that. And so what's unique about targeting these local air pollutants is that when we talk about the ways we can reduce the emissions, we don't have what we call sort of a really standardized emission factor for each of for the amount of fuel burned. So when it comes to greenhouse gases, we just know from the chemistry that when you burn a certain gallon of gasoline or diesel, we know what the greenhouse gas emissions are going to be from that. But the types of pollutants that are in the air that you breathe are going to vary quite a bit depending on the engine, depending on other sort of materials in the manufacture of that fuel. So there's more variability in what you breathe than what it is as it relates to global climate pollutants. So then, of course, the other areas that we are focused on are aircraft engines and APUs. They emit ultrafine particulate. And then anywhere we have roadway traffic. So those are the areas that we're most specifically focused on, and what I'll talk about in my presentation. Next slide. So I'm really going to divide up the airport into the general areas the way we think about the airport and the emission sources on it. And part of that has to do with what we control and what we own, and then what we can maybe influence, and where we have less of an ownership over the fuel types or the vehicle types, or the sources of the combustion. So you might have heard about some of the things we've been doing on the ground transportation side. And when I talk about ground transportation, I mean basically everything on our roadways, all the vehicles coming to and from the airport, all the ways that people get here before they fly or leave here. And so the areas where we've been focusing a lot of our activity has been on electrification. Certainly for light duty vehicles, that's the one that's easy, it makes sense. We're the first to have an emission standard or an environmental performance standard for all of the TNC fleets as well as the taxi fleet. And just last year, we passed an additional incentive that is a financial incentive for electric vehicle activity. So we actually have something specific to incentivize more electric vehicle activity here. And that incentive is not based on just the number of electric vehicles in the fleet, but actually how active they are at this airport. So we're really trying to incentivize that activity here. The other areas where we're definitely focused is electrifying the rental car fleets as well as our own fleets. We have a sustainable fleet plan that was also issued in the last couple of years, where we have specific targeted electrification efforts. Certainly all of our light duty fleet, we actually use more gasoline than diesel at the Port of Seattle. So really getting more electric vehicles in that fleet is pretty critical. And if you've watched pretty much any TV commercial or the Super Bowl, you probably are aware that the rental car fleets are really pushing heavily on electric. It used to be that we'd have to nag them about it, and now it's changed. They're like, they can't get enough, and they really want to see charging infrastructure very quickly. So we're excited about that, and we're really seeing that that's where a lot of movement is happening, where we're able to basically eliminate tailpipes, and that's a very easy way to get to emission reductions. And then other things that we're doing, we're working a lot. I imagine in the future, you'll hear more as we work on our ground transportation emission reduction strategy, which has the lovely name GITRs. But when we have more to say about that, I'll get into it. But we're exploring some other things to really incentivize people to come to the airport or use the airport with green modes. And the technology is really ripe now that we could start partnering with airlines where you get a bundled free transit ticket or subsidized transit ticket with your airline ticket, so that it's basically, well, now the whole thing is mapped out for you, and it incentivizes you to move to those greener modes. So that's a sort of bundled highlights from that side of the airport. Next slide. When it comes to the building related emission projects, this is where we have the ownership and control, but where we also have some pretty significant challenges. The main sources are what we call point sources, or where it's sort of from a single stack related to our building emissions, is really from the natural gas boilers that we use to heat all the terminal buildings, and also the diesel generators that we use for backup power. So you might have heard that we're using renewable natural gas in that boiler plant now, as well as our bus fleet. And so that reduces the carbon emissions, but it doesn't reduce the criteria air pollutant emission reductions. And part of what we're doing to solve that is explore how we're going to switch our entire central plant to electric heating. Now, it is not a small feat to move from natural gas to electric, because that requires switching from steam heating, which has a specific diameter size pipe, to hot water heating if you move to electric, which has a much bigger pipe. And so you can probably imagine over the last 50 to 60 years of build outs, it looks like some crazy cartoon with all sorts of pipes everywhere, that if we want to make a switch like that, it requires a significant capital investment. So we are exploring all of those options right now and looking at which ones to recommend to move forward and put into our capital project. We are looking at zero carbon backup power options as part of the sustainable framework, which is the framework we now look at every new capital project. We look at it through a sustainability lens. And each of those, we are now asking the developers of, or the planners of that project, to explore zero carbon backup power options for that. And as part of those, to look at zero emission. We recognize that as we are moving more and more towards electrification, as we are electrifying all the fleets and all the cars that I just talked about, we need the backup power systems that can power that if things go wrong. And right now, those are diesel generators, and we would really like to move to either hydrogen or other, maybe there's a role for batteries, although they really aren't, the technology isn't quite there yet. But basically, we want to look at different options so that backup power can also be basically without a tailpipe, so to speak. Next slide. Finally, and this is where all my passion projects are at the moment, we're really looking at ways we can reduce emissions on the airfield. And from a relative perspective, I mean, I'm sure it's no secret to the communities around here that the biggest source of our emissions is from aircraft. And it's also the trickiest for us to have any real control over. But it is an area where once they're on the ground, what can we do to ensure that they're using their main engines and their APUs as little as possible? And so one of the things that we implemented it began in January 2021, is that we put into the regulations for the airlines that they have a limit on how long they're allowed to run their auxiliary power units. Those are the jet fuel burning power units that run the electrical and the heating and air conditioning on board the plane without the main engines on. We really want them to limit the amount that they're using that, so that basically when they get to the gate, they hook up to the preconditioned air and the 400 hertz power and turn those APUs off. So we set that runtime limit. We put that into effect in January 2021, but what we don't have is an ability to enforce that. And so part of a project I've been working on is using sound detection systems to detect whether those APUs are on. APUs have a very distinct sound signal. They sound kind of like a high-pitched vacuum cleaner, for lack of a better term. And so we're starting to integrate with our operations team, who are using different visual detection systems for what's happening at the gate, to add this auditory detection system so that we are able to track how much the APUs are actually running. It's kind of interesting to learn that the airlines themselves also don't know at a gate-by-gate circumstance how much those APUs are running. They're able to get data from the aircraft sort of after the fact to know, oh, okay, the APU ran this much, but they don't have any real-time information. And so we'd really like to not only use that detection system to understand what's happening, but to also use that to give signals to the pilots to say, hey, this is on, or you've exceeded the runtime limits, and to change behavior in the moment. And also as part of that, we're working to make sure that the preconditioned air systems and the 400 hertz, so that is the plug-in systems, are adequate for what the crew and the passengers want. We've been tweaking the air temperatures. Alaska's been a fantastic partner in trying to figure out how to dial this in. It is so challenging because you try to set the temperatures for what you think people like. And of course, you probably know from in your own house, somebody's really warm, somebody's really cold. So we have to try to find the right balance of that. So that's an ongoing project for us. And then you heard from the airlines that electrifying all of the ground support equipment vehicles, so that's basically all the little support vehicles you see scurrying around the airfield. We now have more than 300 we're getting close to 350 pieces of all electric equipment at the airport. We have just now finished building out all of the charging infrastructure that the airlines need in the south half of the airport. That was delayed for a while as we were building the international arrivals facility. And with all that construction, we didn't have all of the charging equipment in place. So now that we have that in place, we're exploring whether additional programs or regulations should come into play or into effect to make sure that that electrification pathway is happening. I will say that with the price of electricity being what it is here at this airport, and the price of fuel being what it is, the airlines are kind of, it's almost self-incentivized that as soon as it's time to replace a vehicle, and sometimes before it's even ready to be replaced, we're seeing the airlines purchase the electric ground support equipment. So that is, from a perspective of air pollutants, you're probably saying, well, what is that in terms of percentage reduction? Of course, if you're moving to electric, that is 100% of all the pollutants because you've removed the tailpipe. So of course, that's a sort of the winning strategy, or turning off the engines like these APU runtime. We think that if we can get these APU runtime limits enforced and everything working smoothly, we can probably save somewhere in the range of 3 million gallons of jet fuel burn per year. So we still got more work to do, but that is airport wide. So that can give you some sense of the scale. It's very hard to quantify that in terms of what that exactly means in terms of the tons of sulfur or tons of particulate. But that gives you a sort of a sense of scale. And then when it comes to the ground support equipment, we're seeing that that's saving on the order of about, it's more like about 400,000 gallons of gasoline and diesel that we're removing by switching out the electric ground support equipment. And I want to try and get us back on time because I know Jim Heilman has many things to say, but I'll stop there and take your questions.
Jeff and then Carl.
Hi, Stephanie. Your enthusiasm is wonderful. And it's nice to see all this going on. I did have one question. How often do you run your backup generators?
We run them basically to test them just per their requirements once a month. And we've done some tests where we want to actually make sure that when we completely go off power, that we can run the whole facility. So the only circumstances we've used them to date have been for testing only. So I'm happy to say that for that backup power. Or at the most, it's been, I don't know, maybe an hour or two, but it is really, so far, it is a very rare occurrence for that to happen.
I have a financial background, and if I was putting pencil to paper at the airport, I'd say, given how often you run them and the capital expenditure you need in order to replace them, I wonder if it's worthwhile.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point. And I think one of the things we're thinking about is, okay, that's the investment we've made for that backup power. As we need to expand it, because we're electrifying more systems, then let's look at what we're adding on to it to make that be zero carbon. But I agree that, I mean, we just invested in that facility, completely switching it out right now doesn't make sense. But we do want to think about the long-term future to get off of the reliance.
Okay, thank you.
Carl and then Brian.
Yeah, I just want clarification on something you said about the APUs at the gate. You said you didn't have the ability to enforce it, but what you described to me was the ability to detect it. And so if you could detect it, then what is the teeth? Yes. If someone does that.
I apologize. I maybe didn't make that clear enough. So the detection that that I was talking about was really a proof of concept we did over the last 2 years. And we now we're building out our detection capabilities with a contractor at 8 gates. And we really can't do enforcement until it's equal access to all, because otherwise, if we're just using those 8 gates, the airlines that are there might get outsized punishment, so to speak. And our intention right now is really to sort of start with information rather than quote unquote, fines, to really understand the situation and then, go from there. So it is detection with the intention to enforce, but we're just not there yet.
And then once you do have that full spread, whether it takes a month or 10 years, what is the enforcement? I mean, you mentioned fines there, so you can fine the airlines if they violate that.
Yeah, presently the way it's written into our rules and regulations, it's not a monetary fine at the moment, but we could explore that and turn that into something monetary.
Thank you,
Brian.
Okay, Stephanie. As a pilot, just to give an example of on the operational side of this, like today I came into SeaTac and I did not have an APU, so we taxied into Delta One. We shut down the number 2 engine, because all of the baggage handlers are on that side of the aircraft, so they can begin their work. And the number 1 engine ran for 10 minutes, because the way the gates are set up at SeaTac is that the power is unavailable till the jetway is touching the aircraft. So I know that the APU burns about 1/4 of the fuel as an engine would. So if I were to come into land and had an APU that was running, I started up once I'm getting close to the gate. I get to the gate. I've gotten the number 2 engine shut down. I can shut down the number 1 immediately upon hitting the gate. The APU is running. When the power comes on for the ground power, I can then turn that power on, turn the APU off, and I've saved probably 2/3 of the fuel of using the APU.
Yeah, and we've talked extensively with the airlines about for safety reasons.
Right, and it's also, it's a safety thing too, because you have this 10-foot fan that's running, and if someone makes a mistake and something flies in the engine or whatever, it's kind of a concern as a pilot. I don't want anyone to get hurt on that side. But as far as fuel use is concerned, if I have an APU that I run just for that shutdown sequence, which is what I do, then I'm using a 2/3 less fuel than if I sit there with the engine running until they finally get the power plugged in and then shut the engine off.
Yeah, so, we can take it offline. We've been, as part of our visual detection systems, we've been monitoring how quickly the airport ground crews for different airlines and at different gates have been plugging in. And there is quite a bit of variability there, and I think room for different operational changes. So happy to continue to talk about it. As Jeff pointed out, I'm deeply passionate about this. I'd love to talk more.
Yeah. One thing that was changed is that they elected to put the ground power functionality with the jetway touching the aircraft. That was done about maybe 10 years ago. So we could have the airplane could be stopped. The jetway could be arriving. If they plug the power in and get power to us, we can shut the engine off. But we have to sit there and wait for the jetway to be operated by somebody and touch the aircraft, lower down the power, bring it over, plug it in. I can use the APU and save 2/3 of fuel. So the APU can actually save you fuel. But if it sits there and runs for an hour while waiting for the next flight, that's a waste. But for shutdown, it's not a waste. If that makes sense.
It does, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. What an illuminating conversation. I'm going to move us forward again because we want to have a chance to hear from the Federal Aviation Administration, get a quick update on the Sustainable Airport Master Plan, and we still have public comment with 10 people who want to comment. So we got a lot to get done in 30 minutes. With that, Dr. Jim Heilemann from the FAA is here to join us. Jim, welcome. I've got your slides. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you confirm you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Thank you. So thank you for the opportunity to come and talk. Really appreciate it. It's an incredibly exciting time to be working in the area of sustainable aviation fuels. I won't lie to you. So I'll cut right into it. We're going to be talking. I want to talk about the SAF Grand Challenge because we've made a lot of good progress there, and I'm going to map our work at FAA against that document. But before getting there, I want to make sure we're all on the same page with SAF. So you can go to slide 2, please. So I want to talk a bit about the benefits of SAF. Start by noting that sustainable aviation fuels are drop-in liquid aviation fuels. This means that They work in today's infrastructure. They work in our fleet of aircraft once appropriately blended, so we don't need new aircraft to operate them. And we get a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions benefit from their use. I'll talk about that in my next slide. And we have extensive measurements to show that their use decreases the amount of non-volatile particulate matter, or soot, that's created by the engines. Technologies exist. We have 7 pathways approved for use, 2 co-processing pathways where the SAF is co-processed at the refinery with petroleum, and there's many more under approval process. A number of different feedstocks already approved, that's widely accepted, broadly supported. I'll be talking a lot more about that. And they're critical to not only our domestic efforts to address the climate impacts of aviation, but also international efforts. Now, on the other side, one of the key barriers, as I'll be talking about, is cost, and I'll come back to that. But let's talk a bit more about the benefit side. Slide 3, please. So the benefit from their use doesn't come from the tailpipe emissions. It actually comes from a consideration of the full fuel cycle. If you measure the tailpipe emissions burning SAF or burning conventional jet fuel, regardless of the source of the jet fuel, or the SAF, you're going to measure basically the same emissions at the tailpipe. The benefit comes from doing a rigorous accounting of the CO2 that results from all the steps of making the fuel. So what we're going from is the process on the left of the petroleum industry to the process on the right, where we get to a circular economy. But in order to know that there is a true benefit there, you need rigorous life cycle accounting. We in the FAA have been at the forefront of doing this alongside partners such as the Department of Energy, the EPA, and our work has gotten jet fuel included within the GREET model, the gold standard model. It's led to the development of the methods under CORSIA, and we're at the forefront of working with our partners across the federal government to ensure there's rigorous accounting with the new provisions for the SAF blenders tax credit within the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act. So let's get to the next slide, please. So our program focus is in 3 primary areas. In terms of testing, to ensure fuels are safe for use, we're at the forefront of working through ASTM International to test new fuel types and to get the ASTM annexes expanded to include additional fuel pathways. We put a lot of effort into that through our ASCENT program as well as our CLEAN program with industry. ASCENT is our partnership with universities. We do a lot of work on the analysis front. This includes the life cycle work I just talked about, as well as efforts to understand the key points of causing SAF to be expensive, as well as doing the detailed supply chain analysis to identify how we could reduce cost and how we can expand supply. And this is also work that's primarily done out of our Center of Excellence, a lot of great work being done at Washington State, as well as work done at the Volpe Center. And then we lead efforts on coordination to support SAF integration to get people across the board working the program. We stood up CAFE with the airlines, the airports, and the manufacturers back in 2006. We've been interested in aviation fuel for a long time, and I can guarantee you we're going to continue to be interested in it for the foreseeable future. So you have a ready partner in the FAA and working SAF. So we've been working this CAFE and other angles. So in terms of the why, the big why, it's honestly SAF is the key to decarbonization. This is very well captured in our climate action plan that was released almost 1 year ago by the Secretary of Transportation at the last COP meeting. The plan actually goes through and identifies everything we're doing across the board. Not just we FAA, but we, the federal government. It included input from NASA, Department of Energy, EPA, USDA, and a big part of the climate action plan to get the net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 from aviation. The biggest contributor is SAF. And about 1 year ago is also when we announced the SAF Grand Challenge. So go to the next slide, please. And within the plan, it really centers around this graphic. So the plan itself, if you've not read it and really want to understand what's in the realm of the possible, what we're working on in terms of addressing the climate impacts of aviation, please do get it. You can find it pretty easily on Google. Just Google FAA Climate Action Plan. But it all boils down basically to this chart. We did a detailed analysis of aviation emissions from the domestic fleet, those operating within the 50 states and territories, as well as international departures by U.S. flag carriers and international flights by U.S. flag carriers. And you can see how emissions changed over the past 20 years. You can see what happened with the pandemic to aviation CO2 emissions. And then we wanted to see what the future could hold. So we looked at, a situation which is completely hypothetical, wherein the airlines did not update their fleets. They obviously are. And this red wedge shows the importance of fleet renewal that's been ongoing and continues to happen by the airlines. The blue wedge shows the importance of new aircraft technologies, those that we in FAA through our CLEAN program and the NASA is working as well, and the importance those could have in the coming decades. And we were pretty aggressive in terms of the fuel efficiency improvement. You can see the potential improvement from operations. And then you see the big green wedge. The big green wedge is SAF. And the numbers that are there, the number for 2030 and the number for 2050, these are aligned with the goals of the SAF Grand Challenge that I'll talk about in a moment. And what it really gets to is in 2030, our goal is to get to 3 billion gallons of SAF use in the United States. And then in 2050, get to 35 billion gallons, which is sufficient to replace all jet fuel uplift within the 50 states and territories, not just by domestic carriers, but by all carriers. And the 50% mark represents our minimum goal from the administration for a SAF life cycle emissions reduction. And the 100% emissions reduction shows what could be possible. Now, mind you, it's really hard to get to a SAF that has net zero or has zero life cycle emissions. It's going to be even harder to get that many gallons of it. But this is what we're working toward. And I want to talk about what we're doing across the board in the government on that front. So next slide, please. So in September of last year, the Secretaries of Transportation, Energy, and Agriculture, alongside the Administrator of the EPA, brought forward the SAF Grand Challenge. This was a memorandum of understanding for our three agencies and then the EPA to work together to push forward on SAF. So we made a commitment to leverage our existing activities and research, development, demonstration, deployment, commercialization, support, and policy for all of us to work together, and then to do what new things are needed, and then to do what we can to implement a supporting policy framework. And out of the Grand Challenge MOU, again, September 2021, we and the agencies made a commitment to put together a roadmap, what we're calling a flight plan for sustainable aviation fuel that shows how we could meet the goals of the SAF Grand Challenge. And the focus of the roadmap is really on how do we address the big barriers. And I briefly touched about this on the other side of the benefits, but the big barriers that we're dealing with right now is reducing cost. It's cost. We also want to ensure that we enhance sustainability, drive down the life cycle carbon emissions, and expand supply. So that's our laser focus with this document. And what I'd like to do is, just walk you a bit through this document and then show how we in the FAA, our research program, how it maps onto it. And if you want to know more, I put the link there. I'll put it in a few other places. Yes, next slide, please. So the goals of the SAF Grand Challenge are shown here. So the jet fuel in 2019, jet fuel use is shown there. It includes, domestic operations by carriers as well as international operations with the different colors shown there. The top line number is the green dashed area is the amount of jet fuel that's actually uplifted within the United States by our domestic flag carriers as well as our international carriers. So in 2019, pre-pandemic was 23 billion. And we're projecting in 2030 we'll be at 26 billion, and then in 2050 be at 34 billion. And our goals are in 2030 to get to 3 billion gallons of domestic SAF production, and then in 2050 to get to 35 billion. And it's not shown here, but in 2019 we were at 5 million. We're higher than that now. We're on our way to what's looking like probably 15 million this year, maybe 20 million. So you can see the difference in the order of magnitude growth that we need to be driving for. So in my humble opinion, it's actually going to be harder to get to 3 billion than 35 billion. But we're working this hard, and I'm going to explain what we're doing. Next slide, please. The roles of each of our agencies, in our memorandum of understanding, we laid out our various swim lanes. And we've actually been working in an interagency manner on SAF for many years now. In 2016, we put out a document on each of our various efforts and how we're coordinated on SAF. And then the SAF Grand Challenge gave us an opportunity to refresh that. So out of the memorandum of understanding among the agencies and the EPA, we laid out, DOE would be focusing on doing the research on production, making the investments in pilot facilities. They have the loan program office, and then they would work with the EPA. DOT, FAA, it's primarily our efforts in the FAA. We developed the overall strategy to decarbonize aviation. That's our climate action plan. Coordinate efforts on SAF testing and analysis, work with standards organizations to ensure safety and sustainability of SAF, continue the international technical leadership through ASTM and ICAO, promote end use of SAF through our coordination efforts, and then support infrastructure and transportation systems that connect SAF feedstock producers, refiners, and the aviation end users. And we'd also work with the EPA. And then just to round it out, USDA will be doing what USDA does best, work with our farmers across the nation, work with the forest folks, and get the feedstocks that are needed, as well as provide support to the biorefineries that we need. So next slide, please. And so we got to work, and we had that as our starting point. We went to work among the agencies and our partners to put together a roadmap to define what needs to be done in the next decade. Our focus is on the things in the next decade to get us to 3 billion and set the stage for 35 billion. So we developed this multi-agency plan for continuing a long-term substantial federal assistance to our R&D, demonstration and deployment, commercialization, workforce development, technology transfer, as well as analysis to inform policy. And we released the roadmap at the Global Clean Energy Action Forum that took place in Pittsburgh 1 month ago. And so that event took place in Pittsburgh. It was really a privilege to be there. Secretary Granholm from the Department of Energy announced the plan. And then we had Assistant Secretary Petsong from DOT come in and also talk about it. And it was really, something that, to have this continuing secretary level engagement on these efforts. Next slide, please. So within the roadmap, it has 6 action areas that we're focusing in on: feedstock innovation, conversion technology, building the supply chains, policy and valuation analysis, and enabling end use, and the communicating progress. And the document itself takes these 6 action areas, divides them into 26 work streams that we're working across the government with nearly 140 different activities. Now that's a lot, so we wanted to make sure we boiled it down to what's really important. So we're doing a lot of things, so I have 2 slides from now. I'll talk about where we're really putting our efforts for the near term. So next slide, please. But I want to talk a little bit in each of these 6 areas. So in terms of feedstock innovation, this would be efforts to continue the support and conduct the R&D on feedstock supply to get the feedstocks that we need there. And a big focus will be on the feedstocks to get us to HEFA, the oil seeds. We need to greatly expand those, as well as work on reducing the carbon scores associated with ethanol production. In terms of conversion technology, this is to continue to support the R&D from through to pilot scale to get new technologies out there to de-risk them such that investors will put money into these processes. A big one for us in the FAA is building the supply chains. We've been doing a lot of supply chain analysis through our Center of Excellence, and that's bringing everyone together from the feedstock producers, the refiners, all the way through the airports and the airlines. Bring them all together, identify the bottlenecks, and then get all the supply chain logistics worked out such that we have bankable business models and we can get the right financing in place. Section on enabling end use, which is really going through and thinking about the fuels from the safety perspective, the infrastructure required to ensure we have the blending facilities that we need, and get everything integrated together. Policy and valuation, doing the analytical work to ensure that the decision makers, whether they be in Congress or they be in state capitals or they be anywhere else, they have the right information to help them make good choices with respect to SAF. And then we want to make sure we're communicating progress as we move along. We don't want to create a report that sits on the shelf and is never used. So we went through and identified the key things that need to happen for 2030 and 2050 to meet these goals. So if you can go to the next slide, I blow in on each of these two sides of 2030 and 2050. So for the things that are really key for 2030, getting the 3 billion gallons. First is to build and support stakeholder coalitions through outreach, extension, education. This is getting all the right people together. This is work we've been doing forever through CAFE and then as well through Ascent Project 1. Maximize sustainable lipid supply. This is getting the feedstock to the HEFA fuel supply process. This is a big one. USDA's got clear lead on this. Decarbonize, diversify, and scale the current fermentation-based fuel industry. This is basically getting the carbon out of the corn ethanol industry, and you can do it. Our researchers in Ascent as well as DOE have shown there's a pathway to get incredibly low carbon scores with ethanol, but you have to go through and do a lot of steps along the way. And this is effort being led by USDA and DOE. Invest in SAF infrastructure. I'm very excited about the new Inflation Reduction Act, Section 40,007. I'll talk about that at the end. There's funding there to actually put in that last mile infrastructure to get blending done appropriately. And develop improved environmental modeling and data for SAF to inform that life cycle analysis. That's work we're doing in Ascent. Inform SAF policy development. Also work we've been doing in Ascent. For example, the researchers we work with at Washington State did a lot of fundamental work that proved very valuable for laying out the SAF blenders tax credit that was approved under the Inflation Reduction Act. Stakeholder outreach and engagement on sustainability. We know this is critical. Enable use of drop-in unblended SAF and SAF blends up to 100%. This is work we're leading out of Ascent, as well as clean. Our goal is to ensure that every aircraft that can currently operate on jet fuel can operate on SAF, unblended SAF, without any conventional petroleum being needed. Putting efforts in there, and then integrate SAF into the fuel distribution infrastructure. Work we're doing across the board. So then support for 2050, looking more at the long term. This is more largely in the realm of, DOE, USDA as well. Conduct R&D on how we scale up our feedstocks, work the feedstock logistics and handling reliability. Handling biomass can be hard, especially lignocellulosics. De-risking the scale up from pilot through to demonstration That's critical for some of these emerging fuel pathways. Build and support regional stakeholder coalitions. This gets back to work we're doing in Ascent and CAFE. Model and demonstrate the sustainable regional supply chains. Again, similar work as I mentioned in the last one. Invest in industry deployment, inform SAF policy development, and then support SAF qualification. Important continuing work. So this slide's just a summary with links that you should be able to click through to the actual Ascent projects that are there. We're standing up a number of new Ascent projects because with the 22 enacted budget, we got a sizable plus up, and we're investing those funds to accelerate our work on SAF, as well as do a lot more on aircraft technology through the CLEAN program. Next slide. One of the amazing things that happened this summer was the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a couple of provisions I've touched on already in here. The first one is the blender's tax credit. This is a new Section 40B tax credit that will go into effect at the end of the calendar year. And it'll provide a $1.25 credit for a fuel that meets a 50% reduction in life cycle emissions and grows to $1.75 and 100% reduction. And then that will be transferred over to the clean fuel production credit in 2025. So across the government, out of the SAF Grand Challenge, we formed a life cycle analysis group to help inform the Treasury as they make their decisions on how to implement these. And we're leveraging our longstanding FAA research on that front there. And then there's the new Section 40,007 grant program. It has $244.5 million for projects related to SAF production, transportation, blending, and storage, as well as $46.5 million for projects related to low emissions aviation technologies. Really proud that the department has decided that our Office of Environment and Energy would be the lead on implementing these programs. And we're working really hard within our office to get everything stood up. And we're looking to have an industry day to meet with interested parties about this program. And we're targeting December 14th. So you can mark that in your calendar, December 14th, DOT headquarters. More information will be coming out. So in closing, the picture on the right shows something I'm very proud of. It's the first flight from continuous commercial production of SAF. United Airlines flight from LAX to SFO, fuel provided by World Energy. So that's first flight, 6 years ago. We've made a lot of progress from there, but we got to do a lot more. So we in the FAA and the government as a whole, we're taking a holistic approach to address aviation's impact on climate change. SAF is central to this approach. We need it now. We're going to need it in the long run. We're going to need a long time. And the U.S. government, this administration is really committed to SAF production through the SAF Grand Challenge. And we're working with industry. The airlines also have a goal of 3 billion gallons per year by 2030. So we're working in partnership with them. And again, really appreciate the opportunity to give you this update. I'm very proud of the work we've done in the SAF Grand Challenge. Be happy to answer some questions.
Jim, thank you so much for that super informative presentation. For participants, let me just remind you, we have 10 people who want to make public comments. So I extra credit for keeping this question and answer period short. Chris, followed by Peter.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Dr. Heilman, for coming back and talking to us again. You gave a great presentation a few years ago also on ultrafine particulates, and I'd just like to bring the two back if we could. If you'd speak real quickly on the toxicity difference between SAF and the current jet fuel, and specifically as we're developing SAFs and making sure that they're drop-in ready, that everything can just go with them, how we're looking at the emissions and, to anything that may have to be added to them to make them truly drop-in ready. I guess I'd like to hear.
Yeah, happy to speak to that, Chris. Thank you. So there's two aspects of toxicity or human health you could consider with this. The first has to do with the fuel handling. There's no difference there. The second would be in terms of the pollutants that are formed from the combustion of the SAF. What we're finding is as we're changing the fuel composition with SAF, what we're doing is we're changing the amount of set of compounds that are known as aromatics. And we're changing the types of aromatics, or in some cases, dramatically lowering them, as well as changing the types with the use of SAF. And when you go through and do that, you end up with a fuel that burns cleaner. And it burns cleaner from the standpoint that it's producing less mass and less number of non-volatile particulate matter, which is going to result in less pollution, degrading air quality near airports and under flight lines. So it's one of those win-win type situations.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay, well, now I'm a little confused because it seems to me, Dr. Hyman, that very early on in your presentation, you told us that there would be no change in tailpipe particulate emissions.
What I said is there's no change in tailpipe CO2 emissions. Carbon dioxide emissions at the tailpipe are unchanged. Black carbon emissions do change.
Okay, so the quality of the emissions change rather than the quantity of the emissions. Is that?
Well, there's a dramatic difference. So the relative, so you have a certain amount of fuel. There's a certain amount of carbon in the fuel, and the vast majority, 99+%, it's well beyond 99. It's a very large number. Percent of that carbon ends up in the form of CO2. There's a very small percentage of the carbon in the fuel that ends up in the form of black carbon, also known as non-volatile particulate matter, also known as soot. So the CO2 amount is basically unchanged. So if you want to know the CO2 benefit, you have to look at how the fuel is produced and do the detailed life cycle accounting. However, if you go through and do that detailed measurement of the soot coming out of the tailpipe, and we've done extensive testing of SAF, and due to some subtle changes in the fuel chemistry that don't affect the overall CO2 emissions, we are seeing a reduction in that black carbon or soot or non-volatile particulate matter, whatever you want to call it. Those emissions are going down.
Okay, so for those of us who live near airports, what is the ultimate impact on the quality of life and health of those of us who live here?
There would be less of a contribution to the ambient particulate matter from aircraft operations, from an individual aircraft operating on these fuels. That would be the impact.
So would you say as a scientist that there would be a net gain to our quality of life and a net gain to our to the health impact?
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? Let's keep going. Thank you so much, Jim. That was super helpful. I know everybody appreciated it. Claire, you want to give us a quick update on the Sustainable Airport Master Plan?
Sure, happy to do so. Can you hear me okay, Brian?
Yes.
Great. Thanks. Everybody, good evening. Just want to check in briefly, as I do at each START meeting, to give you a progress report on our activity with the Sustainable Airport Master Plan. I believe last time I mentioned, because some of the cities are affected, that we were out collecting traffic counts at various intersections around the airport. That work has concluded, and now we're working with WashDOT and the FAA team and our team to analyze the data that came from collecting that traffic analysis. So I wanted to just report on that because, again, we were out on city streets. We were in some of the neighboring communities, and just want to make sure that you hear what we're doing when we're doing work outside of the airport analysis building. So one thing that we found interesting is that evidently many projects across the region are doing the same thing, where they're collecting new data and validating it and analyzing it because people are catching up with the change in activity between 2019 and 2022. So anyway, more to come on that. And we continue to work with the FAA on an updated schedule, but I don't have any further information on that right now. And when I have some, I will share it with you. Thanks. And that's it, Brian.
Thank you, Claire. I appreciate that. It's time for public comment. As I mentioned, we have 10 people signed up to talk. I told you at the beginning you'd have 2 minutes to talk, and since I made that commitment, I won't back off from it, but we've been here a long time. I'm sure everybody present, including all the members of the public, would appreciate it, people being succinct. And Dory will elevate you to be able to speak. As I call on you, we're going to start with Juna Rajab, excuse me if I didn't get that name right, David Goebel, and then Ursula Euler. Juma, Dory, can you unmute Juma and let her speak?
Yeah, I do not see a Juma in the attendee list.
Okay.
Okay, go to.
Let's go to David Goebel then. David, you've got the floor. I can hear you. I cannot see you, but I can hear you. I can see your name on the screen. Thank you, David. Ursula Euler, followed by Kate Spellman. Dory, can you, there we go. Ursula, I can see you and hear you.
Okay, I cannot see myself. And Mr. David Goebel, just before me, made a really good point. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good, at least you can hear me. I cannot see you at the moment, neither myself. I've also noticed that I thought, Mr. Brian Scott, you said at the beginning of the meetings that this is a public meeting and that people would see each other and hear each other. And I just, for the public record, want to state that during this entire meeting, I did not have access to chat. I did not see other attendants from the public. And I also find that this is not good public participation or the opportunity for it, and not good government. But that was not really going to be my main point. My main questions are, number one, did I understand that right, that within a few years of the 30 billion of sustainable fuel that would be needed, 3 would be available by all estimation? And if I understand, that's 10%. And if I understand you right, the airlines will only be using it if it's financially feasible for them. It's unrealistic to think that costs of aviation fuel will be tied to cost. It will be tied to cost of competitive products like fossil fuels and also the need, the demand. So I see somewhat work there, and my question is, will there be regulation for airlines to actually meet their requirements that they're pronouncing, and what will the consequences be if they don't meet their memos of understanding and their goals? Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Somebody is signed in as Kevin. Based on your email, it looks like your last name is Zella Kosick, and then Kate Spellman. Kevin, are you there?
I don't see a Kevin, so I'm going to go and
To Kate Spellman, followed by Jessica Satori.
we have a Katie.
Katie, are you Kate Spellman? Let's go to Jessica Satori, followed by Jen.
Hello, I'm Jessica Satori.
Hi, Jessica.
Hi. I just wanted to also comment on this format. It doesn't really work for me. I wish I could see people like a regular meeting, but I just wanted to, you were talking about equal opportunity and getting information for this new study coming up. And I'm actually looking for relief now. I live mid-island and I have many flights going over my house, and this affects sleep. It affects me economically as a musician. I can't record, and it's also a health hazard. It's like almost like a bad neighbor who comes to your door and knocks every minute and a half to 2 minutes sometimes. And last night it was till, well up beyond 11 o'clock at night. And then it goes 24/7. But the worst part was just not even getting to sleep until 1 and then having to get up at 5 and work. We do not qualify for mitigation being on Vashon. We don't have representation. We don't have noise monitors. It doesn't matter if it's northbound or southbound planes. I'd like to say I come from an aviation family. So I support aviation, but I don't support it. Sometimes we can get 12 planes in 20 minutes, and that's very disruptive, especially mid-island, Quartermaster Harbor, and especially during the summer when we have to open the windows because there's no air conditioning. And people have poo-pooed the difference in ambient noise when it's silent, and then planes fly over, especially when they throttle down right over my house. And that's where they're going is there's no variation of going away from my house at all. It's just right over. And so I just want to make my point in closing that I sleep downstairs, and even the Bose earplugs, the sleep buds that help mitigate noise at night, if I was to turn them up to where I can't hear a plane, it would cause permanent ear damage, according to Bose. So that is my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Jen, looks like Jen Kettle, followed by Mary Kay Lanier.
We don't have them in the
Either one, okay. How about Roxanne Thayer and Philip Hansen?
We have Roxanne.
Roxanne, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You really have rendered the public invisible. You're not even showing our images when you allow us to speak. That's nothing short of an outrage. You've made the public invisible completely, and it's completely antithetical to the idea of open government. And in fact, you have had a pattern of exclusionary behavior towards Vashon and Maury Island inhabitants. And I'm going to go over those briefly. The first one was when one of your speakers, and I have the name because I've discussed that with one of your representatives, stated that you don't evaluate noise based on complaints. And what you said was that when I asked, I was told that you base them on the noise monitors. So Vashon and Maury, although we asked for 2 noise monitors, we were given 1. And now that one has been taken away and it's sitting in a closet, not being used. Another example of excluding Vashon Maury Island. The next one is now you've shut us out of meetings. In the past, the largest attendees, the largest amount of attendees have come from Vashon and Maury Island. And I can't help but ask if your reason for blinding us and shutting us out is to further exclude Vashon and Maury Island from having any face or any voice in your meetings. And finally, I have several questions. I have many questions about every presentation that was given. I currently serve on the Women's Advisory Board to the King County Council. I have served on the on multiple commissions and boards for King County, and every single one of those, we have had to abide by the Washington Open Public Meetings Act. That's RCW 42.30. I'm wondering if you believe that you are governed by that RCW. One question, and I know now because the last person, several persons back, asked several very good questions, and she'll never be answered. None of us will ever be answered because this is just public comment. We're not allowed to get answers for our questions that we give in public comment, which is very exclusionary as well. So that's my one question. I would like an answer. Do you believe that you are governed by the Washington Open Public Meetings Act, 4230 RCW? And when will you go back to open meetings in person? And when will you go back to open Zoom meetings? You know, our chat is completely shut. I can't even ask the chair a question. Okay, can I get my questions answered, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roxanne. For what it's worth, for the folks in the public, I want to say that I thought that you were going to be able to see us throughout this meeting and that we were going to be able to see you as you spoke. I'll take your word for it that you can't say us. I don't know why. And I similarly don't know why we can't see you as you're coming in to speak. So I'm confused by that, and I'll try and find out an answer to that question.
What about my other two questions?
We've heard your questions, and we'll take them to our steering committee for discussion.
And when will I get an answer?
I would be happy to commit that we will discuss these at the steering committee and as part of the agenda for the next meeting, address those questions.
Thank you.
Philip Hansen.
We do not have a Philip.
Okay, so I think that's everybody that signed up that was present just now. We will get a meeting summary out in the weeks ahead. The next START meeting is December 14th, 5 to 7 p.m. And whether or not we're going to do that meeting in person or via Zoom is to be determined. We heard you. We heard your frustration about this. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I apologize that we're 15 minutes over time. But we sure had a lot of substantive information today. I hope that was useful to everyone. So we're adjourned. Marco and Lance, could you stick around for a minute to debrief?
Sure, yeah.